Hello, class, and welcome to our second to last meeting, or our penultimate lecture for this semester. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe and sane in these times. Today, we'll be talking about reliability and liability in technology. But first, a couple of announcements. The first one is that the midterm revisions are done. That's it. That's the full announcement. The midterm revisions themselves, I did not give a grade for the assignment. I just added points on to your original midterm score. Then I'll talk about course evaluations, the updated personal code of conduct, which is an assignment that is now available and due next week, and then the final report. So for the course evaluations, two things. First, there's the NJIT university-wide course evaluations, and second, there's a survey that I've put together on Canvas. It's an anonymous survey. It's 7 questions that are generally short answer. They're specific to this class, where I'm asking for your insight about what did you find useful, what was least useful, what are things that you liked or didn't like. And then the last question I think is particularly important based for helping me understand how to go forward with this class if we continue to do this in an online setting in the fall, based on whatever public health directives exist at the time, where I'm looking for your insight into what things worked well in the online setting, what would you like to see more of in the online setting, these kinds of things. So I'm really interested in what your feedback is here. I'd really appreciate it. It's anonymous, so feel free to say whatever nasty, terrible things you want. This is for helping me make this class a better, more effective class going forward. So far, there are 8 students who have taken this. I think only, though, 4 of them have actually finished the survey. I can see if I click on one of these students what the answers are, but if you haven't finished it, then it comes back and just says this has not been fully submitted. So most of you have not taken this, but I please encourage you to do so. This is very useful for me. Secondly, there is, as I mentioned, the NJIT course evaluations that the university does. So those are now available. You can see them in Canvas. There's a button for course evaluations at the bottom. Just click that and you'll be able to answer questions about how effective the class was, and a number of other kinds of questions. These are questions that are valuable for evaluating this course compared to other courses in the college and in the university. Super helpful for me to evaluate how this class compares to other versions of this class and how I'm doing as an instructor. And also it helps the university in evaluating the effectiveness of their curriculum. So please take this as well. So far, about a quarter of you have done this. So thank you very much to those of you who have already done this. And for the remainder, please, I encourage you to do this as well if you have the time. All right, so the next thing is about a new assignment. This is your updated personal code of conduct. Based on what you have done in the first personal code of conduct or personal code of ethics assignment at the beginning of the semester. Because we can talk all we want about ethical theories, but in the end, all of this is supposed to be valuable for you, not necessarily to make you a more ethical person, but to give you the tools to evaluate new situations and new scenarios as they come up in your life. So the primary aim for this is to give you the opportunity to reflect on how this class has impacted your views of what is ethical or what it means to address these ethical dilemmas. If they have impacted you at all, hopefully the answer to that is yes. I mean, the main takeaway for this class, I think, is that the world's complicated and you need to think carefully about how to address ethical issues, and oftentimes it's not a black and white kind of thing. So the main carryovers from the original personal code of conduct assignment was, or the first 2 questions about listing 3 rights you believe are important and 3 steps you think you should take when you encounter an ethical dilemma. So they're basically copied over from the original assignment. Then the next questions are about revisiting the scenario you discussed. How might you evaluate it now, or has your view on the scenario that you described changed? And then the last 3 questions are reflective and valuable for me about whether you think this class has better prepared you for future dilemmas and what kind of ethical theories are most closely aligned with your core morals. And what, if anything, in this class was particularly impactful. The last question, again, is useful for me from a reflective standpoint, but hopefully this assignment gives you some insight into what you may have learned from this class or how things might be different from this class, that hopefully this class wasn't just a waste of time, that you actually got something substantial away from it. All right, and then as we round out the semester, the last bit is the IS350 final exam. So there is no final exam in terms of a test. Instead, as with the midterm, I'm asking for a final report. So the final report has a few sections. There's the identification section, which is just basically your name and listing the current topic. This is important, though. Then there's the statement section, which is basically a description of your topic and your scenario. So talk about your scenario in enough detail so I understand what your scenario is, who the moral agents are, what the ethical dilemma might be. It doesn't have to be verbatim what you put in the discussion forum at the beginning of the semester. I will grade you based on what you put here, but it should be at least closely related to that, and you can reuse whatever you had in your midterm report for this as well. This is sort of by design. Now, the analysis section is where the majority of your work comes from. So there are 5 questions here. The first 2 should be relatively straightforward. The first one is just identifying the moral agent you're going to analyze, and then identify 3 courses of action that this moral agent may take in this scenario. So this is very similar to the ethical analysis homework assignment. Now, the third question is to analyze the scenario using the 5 objective ethical theories that we have. So we know the 5, they're listed here. Be sure that for each ethical theory, it's important that you evaluate all 3 courses of action. So it's not enough to just say, Kantianism suggests that this topic is violative of the second categorical imperative, so we shouldn't do this thing. You should explicitly state this action is consistent or this action is not consistent, and you should do that for each action. This is particularly valuable or important for act utilitarianism, where you have metrics that you should evaluate, and each one of these courses of action should have a number or at least some relative scale so you can order them. This is an important part of the assignment. Question 4 is an extension of this, but instead of using the ethical theories, I'm asking you to apply clauses from the ACM Code of Ethics. So I'm asking for at least 2 clauses from the ACM Code of Ethics and 2 clauses from the ACM Software Engineering Code of Ethics. What you do is you should take these 2 clauses and then evaluate the 3 courses of action according to these clauses. So this gives you some insight about, well, which clause are you saying is the most important? There's perhaps it's the first one is keep the public good forefront, and the second one may be don't violate privacy unless you are authorized to do so. Which one of these actions is most consistent with each one of these clauses? So explain this in a similar kind of way as you do for the ethical theories. And then finally, you have to take a stand. So which concrete action do you recommend in number 5? But importantly, it's not enough to just say you should do X or I would recommend Y. You should say, based on the ethical analyses in the ACM Code of Ethics, we see the most support for action A. So we should do action A. It's important that you call back to the analysis that you've done, because that's kind of the whole point of this assignment. At the beginning of this, once you've identified the 3 courses of actions, I could just ask you, which one would you do? And you wouldn't need to do any sort of analysis here. But the point is, this analysis will help you evaluate and then justify why your specific action is good in some objective way based on the theories that we've discussed in class. All right, so that's the main things that you need. As with the majority of my assignments, there's a grading rubric you can look at. So all of this is broken down with providing reasons why this topic is important to computing, what is the ethical issue relevant to your scenario, identifying the moral agent, analyzing or identifying 3 courses of action. All these things are listed here in the rubric. Please check them out, because this is what I'll be doing to evaluate how well you do on the final exam or on the final report. So everything you see here is the things that I will be looking for. So I've given you some hints as well. So like for Kantianism, you should say something about categorical imperatives. For act utilitarianism, say something about quantification. So this is generally a metric question. For social contract theory, talk about Rawls' theories of justice or rights. These kinds of things. There are examples in there for you. And also look back at last week's lecture where you can see examples where I've sort of walked you through some of these analyses that you can do. I've put together a report template as well, so you can go through and see the section headings are important. This helps me know where to look for answers to these specific questions, so I encourage you to use this. There's a bibliography section. Again, you have no real reason not to have a good bibliography or a well-formatted bibliography, considering Microsoft Word provides you this capability, so do that here as well. And that's it. That's all you need for your final exam. It's due May 13th, so that's in 3 weeks. All right, for the current event presentations, this is the last week of current events. There are 4 from Ranok, Mithun, Sam, and Daniel Biven, so you should have those available to view this evening. And then getting into what we'll actually talk about today, as I mentioned, the main course or the main topic of today's lecture is about liability and responsibility. So there are a few learning objectives that I want you to get from this lecture. The first is to describe at least one technological error that resulted in some significant real-world impact. So you can imagine there are many errors, compile errors or bugs that you might have in code or in technology, and maybe they don't really do anything or have no significant impact on the world, but we'll show you some examples where this was not the case. Then I'll ask you, or you should be able to define different types of technological errors. So different classes of errors. Contrast the level of testing necessary into technology use cases. So when we start talking about testing towards the end of the lecture, this will become more clear. And then describe some potential steps a technologist could do to increase reliability or decrease liability. So how might we sort of address these issues of reliability? So first, in terms of reliability and liability, maybe you've seen what's called the fail whale from Twitter, where back in Twitter's earlier days, it was very often the case that you would get a message like the one here saying Twitter is over capacity and Twitter be broken, or you wouldn't be able to access the service. Reddit was the same way for a while. Both of these platforms have sort of improved in their reliability recently. But this sort of sets the stage for the kinds of things that we'll deal with, because in reality, all software can and likely will fail. And there's a whole list, many lists in fact, of software failures in recent history. I'm going to be a little bit more broad or more general in this discussion, not just about software failures, but about hardware failures, because the line between software and hardware is kind of blurry now, based on firmware, and a lot of the technology that gets used has both components in it, and there's some the processes that you might put in place to fix these or address these issues are the same. So we've already talked about some kinds of failures and reliability issues in terms of the Equifax breach with security. There are big examples here. So from a couple of years ago, when Toyota reached a multi-billion-dollar settlement with the United States to end the probe into their accelerator problems, back when there was a claim that the brake pedals on Toyotas would stick and stop working, and this caused potentially several, or ostensibly or allegedly caused a number of crashes. Back, I guess this was a year ago, British Airways was disrupted by some really significant IT failures of their reservation system, which caused massive delays globally. And this is a not unheard of thing for airlines to encounter these kinds of issues. And then we have much more serious issues like the Challenger accident, which again is not necessarily a software issue, but we'll see the sort of processes around the steps that led to the Challenger explosion are similar and can be mitigated in similar kinds of ways. You may have heard of other ones that are not necessarily massive errors, but things that you might run into on sort of more standard kinds of projects. So back in the late 90s, NASA put together the Mars Climate Orbiter. This was a joint effort between NASA and the European Space Agency. And after about a 9-month journey from the United States, or from Earth to Mars, the Mars Climate Orbiter was supposed to do an orbital insertion to set it up in orbit around Mars, but it failed. And the reason why it failed was because a navigation error resulted from an incorrect translation between English and metric units. So there should be a relatively or pretty clearly straightforward issue that one part of the software is using meters and the other part of the software is using feet or miles, and they did not have some mechanism to check whether these measurements were consistent. And this caused the Mars Climate Orbiter to then burn up in the atmosphere in Mars after millions of dollars and months or years of people's time. These issues also pop up not just in direct use cases, so how technology gets used, but also in backup use cases or disaster recovery issues. So recently, GitLab experienced a massive failure of their backup system that was resulted in 300 gigabytes of data being lost. Now, many companies are required to have disaster recovery plans, but because these plans are often complex. So when I used to work for a company that did work for a bank, these banks required us to be able to have continuity of operations plans in place, where if one of our offices was damaged or unworkable, that we had a plan in place to provide services to this international bank through some other office that we had. But by the very nature of these disaster recovery plans, they're difficult to test, and as a result, they can lead to errors that, when they actually get used, may cause significant problems, as GitLab experienced. If you were paying attention to the news back in 2013, you may have heard of healthcare.gov, which is still a thing that's around today, that still comes up in the news. This is a massive undertaking in terms of developing a web platform that many people in the United States would be able to use. But when it was rolled out on October 1st of 2013, healthcare.gov's website crashed within 2 hours. This is maybe not directly leading to loss of life in the same way that the Challenger explosion might have, but certainly it was a massive political issue for the Obama administration. And the issues that led to, or the issues that popped up in this kind of botched rollout of a big governmental website are things that we still deal with today, that even the current administration has to deal with the Paycheck Protection Act and the IRS's website about trying to provide people with information about their stimulus payments. How can they get that? So it's rolling out these very large websites, especially something like healthcare.gov that has to communicate with many different pieces from the IRS to insurance companies, can be problematic and very complicated. How do we address issues in these kinds of systems? Now, also, we've already talked about the Tesla autopilot crash. This is both a thing that I've discussed in class and one of your fellow students has discussed, but this is clearly a failure that resulted in loss of life. Now, interestingly, in February of this year, the National Transportation and Safety Bureau, the Safety Board, the NTSB, released a report about this accident where they identified 3 main issues at play. One is that the driver had not taken control of the car because he was distracted by a video game on his phone. That 2, Tesla's collision avoidance system was, quote, not designed to detect the crash barrier, end quote, that the car ended up running into. And 3, that Tesla's autopilot system did not provide an effective means of monitoring the driver's engagement. So there's both the fault of the driver here, and the NTSB actively calls out Tesla for being ineffective in making sure that the driver was sufficiently engaged in the task of driving. So what I just showed you were a number of failures in technology that were primarily like unanticipated bugs or results of poor design that was built into the technology. But not all technological failures are based on like errors that are built into the system or errors that sort of went undiscovered. For instance, back in April of 2013, the Associated Press's Twitter account was hacked. And when it was hacked, somebody posted a tweet saying that 2 bombs had exploded at the White House and President Obama was injured. This was very much a hoax. This hack pushed these tweets out that were very fake, but it identified a very significant and strong interplay between the online information ecosystem from places like Twitter and the stock market. It turns out a number of investment organizations or investment companies rely on social signals from newspapers, from Twitter, from Facebook, from a number of these places to evaluate sentiment and to evaluate when some massively impactful event occurs. And when the Associated Press, a reputable news organization, posts that a bomb exploded at the White House and injured the president, a number of these systems identified this issue and then immediately and automatically sold off billions of dollars worth of assets. Fortunately, the markets were able to recover fairly quickly, actually very quickly, when this tweet was identified as being a hoax and was a security issue that was then removed, and the markets recovered very quickly. But it does identify an issue with the connections between the social and the financial worlds. And this begs the question of, well, this isn't necessarily a bug in the automated trading tools that these investment companies use. You would expect that the Associated Press is a reputable Twitter account or is owned by a reputable Twitter account. So relying on that information seems reasonable. The system worked as intended when that potentially very impactful tweet was posted by this account. It sold off a lot of assets before the market could respond. So there's value there. So it's not necessarily that, it doesn't seem like it's a bug within the trading software, and it's probably not a bug within Twitter's software, because it could be the case that it was a disgruntled Associated Press employee or some Associated Press person's credentials were stolen and Twitter itself wasn't hacked, but the credentials for the account were made available. So it's really unclear about how exactly or what kind of error this is, but certainly it was an unintended consequence, a thing that wasn't foreseen or wasn't thought about, that had significant real-world impact. So now that we've talked about a bunch of examples of failures, we can try and put together some sort of typology or classification of what kinds of failures might you see. So one is just the sort of poor design issue. So this might be the healthcare.gov website, where it was very complicated, overly so, and some design choices that were made resulted in fragility of the system, or maybe it was designed in a way that wasn't optimal for its application, or it used older pieces of software and sort of kludged them together in a suboptimal way, which is actually how many electronic health record pieces of software used to work. You could have unforeseen issues. So the Twitter and Associated Press and automated trading system, I think, is very clearly an unforeseen issue. This was a surprise. The software worked as intended, but its intent in the particular context was maybe unanticipated. There are data errors. So as with the Mars Climate Orbiter, this was an error in data format, but it could also be an error in data entry. We'll see about that in a few minutes. There's negligence, so I just wasn't paying attention. So the Challenger accident may be an example of negligence, where the NASA administration at the time and contractors knew about the potential issue with the O-rings that led to the Challenger explosion, but ignored them or went through with the launch anyway. So this is a negligence issue where you had the opportunity to do something and did not. And then there's PEBCAC. So maybe you've heard of PEBCAC. A good example of this is somebody is trying to use some system and the system is failing, but the error isn't with the system. The error exists between the keyboard and share, or the problem exists between keyboard and share, the acronym PEBCAC. So given these different types of errors, and we know that all software can and likely will fail, what then? How do we address these kinds of issues? and really who is responsible for these failures. So this is ultimately the question that gets asked when some significant failure occurs. Who was responsible? How did this happen? Is the responsibility on the shoulders of the developer? Did the developer miss something? Was the developer negligent? Was the developer inexperienced? Was it a poor design issue? Or is this responsibility on the shoulders of the users? That, well, since we know that all software can and likely will fail at some point, then maybe the responsibility or the risk falls onto the individual user, and it's sort of a caveat emptor that, well, you know this, so the buyer should really just beware and maybe not rely on a single version of or a single instance of technology, build in redundancy, or do something else. If we look at online service providers or technology companies, they're actually pretty upfront about who they think or who they want you to believe is responsible. So for instance, this is Google's privacy and terms of use agreement from a few months ago, where they lay out in their warranties and disclaimers section that we don't make any commitments about the content within the services, the specific functions of the services, or their reliability, availability, or ability to meet your needs. We provide the service as is. So basically they say all that risk is yours. We don't have any responsibility for what you do. And we see this here again under liability. When permitted by law, Google and Google suppliers and distributors will not be held responsible for lost profits, revenues, data, financial losses, or exemplary or punitive damages. That basically they put their hands up and say, you are responsible for everything that happens here, or that happens with our technology. Now, Google used to be this company with the logo of, or the motto of don't be evil. They've gotten a lot of flack for that recently, so maybe you think, well, this is just a Google thing that they're trying to cover themselves, but this is actually pretty standard language for technology companies. So this is from Microsoft and the terms of service for Microsoft Word, where it says essentially the exact same thing, except for any repair, replacement, or refund from the manufacturer or installer or Microsoft. You have a very limited warranty under this agreement, and you cannot recover any damages, including lost profits, direct or consequential, or incidental damages. And even if you could, by local law, recover damages from Microsoft, they make it clear you cannot recover more than what you paid for the software. And that's their approach. Again, that it's not their responsibility, it's you, the user's responsibility, or the purchaser's responsibility to use this software in a reasonable way. And if you suffer some damages as a result of its use, the fault is yours. Now, you may believe that, you may agree with that, or you may not. It's questionable about whether those terms of service are would hold up in a court of law, but I think we could make some claim that the limitations on those claims or terms of service is really affected by the context. So we can ask this question about how does context impact the responsibility or the liability for these kinds of failures. So you may imagine in the context of Snapchat, what is the likelihood of experiencing some damage or loss from Snapchat? Maybe that's relatively low, though you could make some claim that maybe you sent a number of illicit photos over Snapchat with the expectation that the photos would not be savable, since Snapchat is an ephemeral platform, but somebody was able to take snapshots or screenshots of the images and then share them or sell them, and as a result you experience some amount of damage. Snapchat's response to this might be that, well, we have no control over what people do with the media that is sent over our service, and once it gets to their phone, it's sort of up to them what they do with it, so we have no real responsibility here. And I think that's potentially a reasonable response. Similarly, with a Tesla autopilot crash, if the driver was distracted because he was playing with Snapchat, then almost certainly Snapchat shouldn't be held responsible for that. That's a user issue. But things are very different in other contexts, right? So if you're Siemens, and Siemens is a big manufacturer of industrial control systems for things like nuclear power plants, then the reliability of Siemens software and hardware is much more important, and the operators of these power plants may have some expectation that Siemens has done their due diligence in ensuring that the technology that's being sold meets some standard and is safe. And you would want that as a consumer, you'd want that as somebody who might live near one of these power plants to know that it's not just the responsibility of the power plant operators and designers to maintain safety, it's the responsibility also of any of their suppliers to make sure they're providing parts that are safe. And we see this actually in all kinds of government contracting, where you can be held responsible and liable for ensuring that the technology you provide lives up or satisfies some set of core standards. Same thing with Boeing and avionics software. We would anticipate that because of the critical nature of software in aviation, that a lot of effort has been put in to make sure that the software is not going to fail, or if it does fail, that it fails gracefully, or that there are robust redundancy systems in place that if one system fails, other redundant systems may take over and ensure that nobody is hurt as a result of some failure in software. We see context in a different way about public safety, though, so it's not just about potential meltdowns of nuclear power plants or planes dropping out of the sky. We can see impacts of software failures in much more subtle ways. So this is an infographic from IBM and how IBM worked with the Manchester Police Department through a predictive policing mechanism to help police know where to go to provide safety in a particular neighborhood or provide safety in a particular area. And IBM claims that after the introduction of this technology, there was a 12% reduction in robberies, 21% reduction in burglaries, 32% reduction in thefts from vehicles, these kinds of things. But if you are developing a system that sends police to one location, then you are, to some degree, removing police from another location. If something like this happens and the non-patrolled location has something bad happen as a result, is that IBM's responsibility? Is that the Manchester Police Department's responsibility? In this world now where we are reckoning with the fairness and transparency in algorithms, where it's difficult to know exactly how a machine learning program is actually working, if nobody really understands what are the features that the system is using to send police to one area and not another, then how does anyone have a responsibility here if no one really is understanding how this system works? And we see other instances of sort of technological systems being used in law enforcement that's resulted in pretty significant issues. So here is the National Crime Information Center. This is a service provided by the FBI. It's a massive database of law enforcement information. It's been around for about 50 odd years. Now, the NCIC is a service that any police department in the United States can access, and it has information on many kinds of issues, from who records of lost or stolen guns and recovered weapons, who was responsible for these crimes, auto and vehicle theft, information about immigration violations, sexual predators or sexual offenses, gang affiliations, unidentified persons, many different databases of information about not just like property that's been damaged or property that's been lost or recovered, but the offenders responsible and what their names are and information about who they are, what they look like, these kinds of things. And in fact, in 2016, the NCIC said they advertised that they set a daily record of 17 million transactions against the NCIC database in a single day. So that's essentially one transaction for every 20 people in the United States. So certainly that's a huge amount of information that is being processed about many, many people across the country. And we might ask ourselves, so if we have this large data warehouse of information about crimes and criminal perpetrators and loss of property and all these kinds of things, in some sense this is a social good, right? So we would want police departments all across the country to be able to have this pooled resource where if somebody committed a crime in one state, a police department in another state who might end up dealing with this individual or finding some car that's been stolen should be able to have access to this. There's value in that from a social good perspective, right? But at the same time, in this world where nothing's obviously black or white, there are complications here. So in the 1980s, there were a number of stories about people being falsely arrested as a result of these computer mix-ups. So here in this article from the Associated Press from 1985, a flight attendant was flying in the southern United States. She landed, and in engaging with a member of security, when she was coming back into the country, U.S. Customs agents in New Orleans identified her name as being similar to one in the NCIC database and arrested her, saying that she was the same person as this, or she was using an alias associated with a criminal from the NCIC database, and she spent a night in jail and ended up being called to testify in front of Congress for the reliability of the information in the NCIC database. If you've ever seen the movie Hackers, this is a similar trope that was used there as well. Another story also from 1985 about a victim who was arrested over 5 separate times for the same data quality issue in one of these databases. Now, often these errors are obvious oversights or obvious issues with names or aliases, but if I claimed to have an alias of somebody else, or I get arrested under an alias, and then somebody who has that same name, like John Doe or James Smith or something like that, or Sheila Jackson, how do we know that if the database isn't providing information about, there are other people with this name or something like that, how are law enforcement professionals, law enforcement agents supposed to deal with this data? And more recently, when we talk about things like the NCIC having a gang database or database of gang affiliations, so a recent study of a New York Police Department database has over 18,000 people as being active gang members, 400 of which are under 18, and there's a massive disparity in terms of race and ethnicity in this data set or in this database, and there are real questions about what is the value of such a database, or how might we engage with this technology when you would have no way of knowing if the New York Police Department has identified you as being a member of a gang. And if you're under the age of 18 but have this gang affiliation in the NYPD database, how does that affect your opportunities in the future? Maybe you want to get a job in a police department, but you can't because you have this gang affiliation for when you were a minor, and who is to say that this gang affiliation is legitimate when it's really unclear how auditing of this kind of database would work. Is this the fault of the developer of the database, though? Or is this the fault of the law enforcement agencies that use the database? Is it some mixture that the database doesn't have some auditing mechanism or doesn't make auditing very easy, so the police department doesn't have the resources to do it? But then should the police department have used or have developed or purchased such a database if they didn't have the resources to ensure its accuracy? Where does the responsibility lie here for the accuracy of this information? So this brings us back to the same question about whether the NCIC is a social good. Fortunately, because of this class, you hopefully have some tools now to evaluate this question. So we can look at this from the standpoint of act utilitarianism. And we can say that if we do some estimate there are about 1 million cars stolen every year in the United States, about half of which are recovered. The NCIC database is responsible for about 20% of those recoveries because of information about reports of stolen vehicles. Then we can say about 10% of cars that are recovered because of the NCIC. If we say that this is about $5,000 per car, or saves us about $5,000 per car, where the owner gets the car back, national interest rates are decreased because insurance companies are not responsible for the full recovery cost of these 100,000 cars, and criminals aren't making profits from stealing cars, then there's a benefit here. So by these numbers, the total value of using the NCIC stolen vehicle database is about $500 million per year. So it's a pretty significant amount of money. If there are fairly few stories of false arrests driven by the NCIC, we make some assumption about one false arrest per year. We have a news story of an individual with the last name Rogan who was falsely arrested and managed to sue after his arrest and was awarded $55,000 as a result. So you might use that as an estimate for the amount of harm caused by a false arrest from the NCIC. Then we can say that, well, if there's only one of these false arrests per year, and this false arrest is 50 grand, or even if it is 150 grand, still the benefits far outweigh the cost. As long as these numbers of false arrests per year are things that are a legitimate value or a legitimate estimate. So from an act utilitarianism standpoint, then the benefit surpasses the harm. Then we say the NCIC is clearly a social good, which is a good conclusion. But if we look at it from a Kantian perspective, we get a different result, right? So here, since Kantianism is deontological, it's not about consequences. It's about rules and whether you're using people as means to an end, that all of these numbers actually don't matter. The key thing is we have one false arrest per year. We're willing to sacrifice that one false arrest for some larger good. So we're going to use this one person who might be arrested incorrectly as a means to providing this cost savings of $500 million a year, and that's not okay by Kantianism, right? That the outcome is irrelevant. We're sacrificing this individual. So from a Kantianism perspective, this is not a social good. Now, certainly there are other ways to view this, one of which is through the ACM Code of Ethics, that the developers of the NCIC database should recognize and take special care of systems that become integrated into the infrastructure of society. So with the NCIC becoming this massively important informational source for law enforcement agencies across the country, potentially globally, then special care has to be taken to ensure some level of accuracy, some level of transparency, some mechanism for auditing, and the developers, the technologists behind this system do have a responsibility through the ACM Code of Ethics to maintain or provide some service along those lines. And if the system is not doing these things or is resulting in harm, then from a social contract theory perspective, based on the rules from the ACM Code of Ethics, then there's real questions about the value of this system. But from that perspective, it's not a question of whether the NCIC should be used. It's whether the developers and the technologists behind it are responsible for the false arrests or harm that's caused by the platform. So we can look at this in terms of errors. What kind of errors are applicable to the issues that we've described in the NCIC? Well, this is primarily, I think, a data error, that there's a huge amount of data that is put into the NCIC, and if you think about how you would even audit that, it becomes very hard, right? So if the person who is doing data input for a particular stolen vehicle or a particular case puts in the wrong name or puts in a very generic alias, and you have some auditor in a different state who is responsible for evaluating accuracy of information, how would that auditor ever even know that that information was accurate or not? It has to be in some way the person that is best suited to understand or identify potential data errors is the individual who's putting that information in. So if these people are putting in incorrect information, or there's maybe no process to make sure that information is right, this could lead to data errors. It could be a negligence issue that we know this is a problem, but nothing's being done about it. It could be a design issue that the system doesn't make it very easy to ensure accuracy, or it could be just an issue of the user, this PEBCAC problem of somebody just put in the wrong information or just wasn't paying very clear attention. So with these kinds of complicated issues, you might have multiple types of failures that could lead to problems. Recently, I guess in 2003, so not so recently for many of you, the Justice Department announced that the NCIC would not be, or the FBI rather, would not be responsible for accuracy in the NCIC for the reasons that I just mentioned, that it might be very hard for the FBI to do some sort of auditing or oversight of this database. So as a result, they exempted the NCIC from some provisions of the Privacy Act of 1974 that provides some guarantees for privacy of U.S. citizens. And the reasoning that the Department of Justice had for this was that it's just not practical for the FBI to have or to be responsible for accuracy of data when data is coming in from many different places all across the country. Much of the information is provided by other agencies, so how can the FBI actually validate this? And agents who are going to use the data set should have some amount of leeway or discretion about the information that they put in and about how they use the information that gets taken out. So even if I'm an agent and I have some information that might not be completely accurate about an alias, or maybe its last known address or something like that, then that might be useful information for somebody in the future, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's correct information, and it could lead to risks for false arrests or some issue. They also claim that if the Privacy Act was strictly followed, then there'd be much less information in the NCIC, so the NCIC would be much less valuable, and there'd be fewer arrests. And even if we do run all things correctly, then the arrests from the NCIC database there are very few false arrests from the NCIC database. So the DOJ's perspective is this isn't a huge issue. Privacy advocates, on the other hand, contend, well, every year with the number of records going into the NCIC is increasing massively, and the more erroneous records you have, the more false arrests you have. So in this regard, accuracy in the NCIC is more important than it ever was before. And there are points here on both sides, right? So it becomes difficult to sort of gauge or evaluate what the real outcome is here without additional information or additional metrics about how many false arrests per year are we talking about. But that's purely a consequentialist kind of argument, right? From a deontological perspective, it's irrelevant. Having more false arrests is bad. So I leave this up to you. Who do you think should be responsible for the data correctness in databases like the NCIC? Is it the responsibility of the developers to have some mechanism for this? Is there some organization or some users in the organization who should be responsible for auditing? Is it the responsibility of the individual user? Is it no one's responsibility because ultimately it's the responsibility of the arresting officer? Where does the responsibility or liability for this lie? Now, that was an exploration of some of the issues that you might contend with when you're building these kinds of systems or interacting with these systems after they've failed. But what can we do beforehand? So how do we get ahead of these kinds of failures? So what can we do to reduce these kinds of issues or increase the reliability of our technology? Well, I'm not going to go hugely deep into this because in the YWCC there are classes about software engineering, but over the past 30 odd years, software engineering has emerged as this significant discipline that is all about processes that we can put in place to facilitate higher quality software. So the whole point here, the definition of software engineering, is the detailed study of engineering to the design, study, development, and maintenance of software with the objective of addressing or reducing issues of low quality software and reducing problems that arise from both quality issues and issues that come with exceeding timelines, budgets, and these kinds of things. So as I mentioned, there's huge research areas and areas of practice around this, both in terms of software engineering and more recently systems engineering. As we develop more and more sophisticated and complex systems, we need to be thinking about how these systems come together for electronic medical records or for nuclear power plants that rely on numerous pieces of software and pieces of hardware and technology all working together. Nicely, though, there was a study from about 10 years ago about how the software industry has changed as software engineering has grown in popularity, where back in the mid-90s, the vast majority of software projects were either canceled or experienced time or cost overruns. But 15 years later, as software engineering has become more prevalent, the number of projects that are delivered on time and on budget and ostensibly of high quality has increased, and it's now outweighs the number of canceled projects, though the number of projects that experience time and cost overruns is still dominant was still dominant in 2009. So suggesting there's a lot of room for improvement in the processes or applications thereof. So when you get into the world of software engineering, there are a number of different kinds of software engineering processes. So you may have already heard of things like Agile or Scrum or these kinds of things. The point is there are many different approaches to software engineering. The waterfall model is generally what big hardware companies use, or what Microsoft used to use for operating systems. You have prototyping, where you have some set of objectives and you're constantly iterating on making demonstrable prototypes, and you just keep adding features to the prototypes to get to your full system. Where there's spiral, the spiral model, where you are again constantly iterating, expanding your feature set, doing evaluation, doing more planning, going back and forth. But a key point in all of these is testing. So in waterfall, it's called verification. In prototyping, it's explicitly testing. In spiral model, it's called evaluation. The key here is testing, and more testing. There are lots of ways to do testing. So there are unit tests or use case studies and all these kinds of things. We won't get into that. The main thing that I'll say for us, though, is can we test for all bugs? And the answer to this question is no. We can't know all possible bugs. We can't evaluate or create tests for all possible bugs, both from a practical standpoint, it might just be way too expensive, and from a theoretical standpoint, that there's not a system that can identify all kinds of bugs. Such a system is not theoretically possible to develop, because then you could apply that system to itself and run into all kinds of meta issues. So we won't get into that, but the main thing is you can't test for all bugs. So if you can't test for all bugs, then this isn't a risk elimination exercise, it's a risk management exercise, similar to what we saw in previous lectures. So then you can have this question about how much time should you spend on testing. Now, if we go back to the technology issues or the technology context that we described before, that's where you can get some answers to this question. So if you're Snapchat, maybe you don't spend a huge amount of time on testing. Your main goal is to get a product out there. You want that product to work well and for people to be happy with it. But does every single pixel need to line up correctly, or do you need to ensure that the filters you add are always doing the right thing, which maybe you've experienced if you try and put a filter on yourself, and then like the dog ear filter that you add ends up putting dog ears 2 feet to the right of your head or something. Is that a really significant bug? Certainly it has impact for the usability of the platform and may drive some users away, but it's not necessarily a safety issue. Whereas the amount of time that should be spent testing for technology that's going to go into a nuclear power plant or on a plane is much more critical, and you should spend much more time testing. You should have a much more thorough testing scheme and testing structure to reduce bugs and ensure quality in these contexts, because here safety is critical, and safety driven by software is an extremely important aspect of how software is used in these contexts. Now, we have the rule of thumb about whether you can be held responsible for something, that the only time you can be morally responsible, that you morally ought to do something, or you should be ethically required to do something, is if you can do something, right? So that means, or the relevance to the discussion here is, well, you can't be held responsible for eliminating all bugs in your system, because you can't do that. It's not practically feasible, and it's not technologically or theoretically feasible. So, but you can be held responsible for risk mitigation in the context that I just mentioned. So here, in this case, maybe it's unlikely that you could have foreseen such an issue. So the developers of these automated trading platforms probably are not ethically responsible for this, because they might not have been able to foresee that this kind of an issue would occur. Now, maybe they could have, that, if we're going to use Twitter or we're going to use social media, there's always a chance of credibility issues. But if you're working in a high-frequency trading environment, the amount of time necessary for verification may reduce the value of the system completely. But from the standpoint of the Challenger incident, where the managers were made aware of the potential issue with O-rings and low temperature environments, that they were ethically obliged to do something about it. And to not do something about it, even though they could have, that they had the information, they could have done something, and they chose not to, that they're then ethically at fault. Here, the answer is a little bit less clear, but there is an important question of, should you use a technology that you don't fundamentally understand? And this was touched on by a number of your fellow students with using technology in medicine, or technology in automation, these kinds of things. If you don't fully understand the software, then you know that you can't take future steps, which means you've eliminated a whole set of things that you could do to ensure safety. Where does the responsibility lie here? It becomes a little bit less clear. So now that we've discussed all of these things, let's end by going back to the learning objectives. Now you should be able to describe at least one technology error that resulted in a significant impact. Define different types of technological errors, like data errors or negligence or design issues, these kinds of things. Contrast the level of testing necessary in use cases. So the example we had was like games or Snapchat or social media platforms versus safety critical industrial organizations or industrial settings, or from the ACM Code of Ethics, anything that gets embedded into the infrastructure of society. Just interesting implications for Twitter and Facebook now. And then describe some potential steps a technologist could take to increase reliability. So primarily here it's employing testing and applying processes of software engineering to help improve the quality of your software and evaluate evaluate the quality as you add new features and you build onto the system. All right, so that's it for the lecture. The next class assignments from our next class is the last class of the semester. Please get those course evaluations in if you have a chance. Your updated personal code of ethics is due, or code of conduct is due, and read and take the quiz on chapter 4, which is about intellectual property. So we'll talk next week about open source software and IP issues. All right, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your week. And as I said, I hope everybody stays safe and